Welcome back. We are beginning the meat of our lectures on the theory of knowledge, and we did a little introductory discussion last time about some of the distinctive questions that arise within the context of this subject, and now we're going to dive right in with a discussion of empiricism, and specifically the empiricism of John Locke. Empiricism is the view that all substantive knowledge originates in sensory experience. That is, that everything that we know that we would deem substantial comes to us originates through the senses. Now, I say substantive knowledge and not all knowledge because most empiricists will be willing to accept that certain capacities and inclinations may be innate, and by innate we mean inborn. So the empiricist may not deny, for example, that the desire to avoid pain and pursue pleasure is an innate, hardwired kind of desire. And the empiricist also may not deny that certain tautological forms of knowledge, for example, logical truths, like the sentence A equals A, is a logical truth. The empiricists may also be willing to admit that there may be some tautological, logical truths which originate not in experience but are known a priori meaning independently of experience, and typically conceived of as knowledge by intuition. But the empiricist is going to insist that all of our substantial knowledge originates in sense experience. John Locke is the most well-known and influential empiricist. He not only establishes the basic arguments for and principles of empiricism, as well as introduce its basic lingo, the concepts of empiricism, but his version of the doctrine is the one that everyone after him reacts to. So, in a sense, Locke begins a conversation about the origins of knowledge, the rest of which after him consists of responses to him. So in that sense, he's extraordinarily influential and important. In the 20th century, empiricism is kind of retooled. It's reconceived by the logical positivists. But even this new empiricism doesn't depart all that much from Locke's original. The essay concerning human understanding, which is you have selections from in your reading in your course pack, the essay concerning human understanding is where Locke offers a complete articulation of an empiricist epistemology. And we've already dipped into this text once already in our discussions on personal identity. The stuff on personal identity that we did from Locke is also from the essay. The essay begins, and essay, I mean, when you think of an essay, you think of something short. I mean, this is the essay, and as you can see, this is volume 1 of 2 volumes, and so this is a massive tome. We will read carefully selected excerpts that'll give you a very good sense of what he's doing here without sort of trudging through all the details, which would go way beyond the scope of an introductory level course. Locke begins the essay with an attack on the idea that there is innate knowledge of any kind, substantive innate knowledge of any kind. Indeed, the whole first book 1 of the essay, is devoted to the critique of the concept of innate ideas. And by innate, remember, we mean inborn, ideas, that knowledge that we come furnished with at birth. And Locke rejects the idea of there being innate knowledge in 2 areas. He denies that there are any what he calls innate speculative ideas, by which he means abstract or theoretical principles such as mathematical, logical, and other such truths. So he wants to say, look, none of the truths of arithmetic, geometry, logic, none of the knowledge we have in these subjects is innate. None of it is inborn. He also wants to deny that there are any innate practical principles. That is that, and by practical principles, he means knowledge which informs action. So when we're talking about practical principles, we mean primarily moral, legal, political, prudential, all the types of knowledge that informs our actions. Locke says none of this is innate either. That both our speculative ideas and our practical principles are acquired by way of sensory experience, not by way not by way of an inborn store of knowledge. Now, there's a certain oddity in Locke's critique. Because the aim of the essay is to articulate and defend an empiricist theory of knowledge, it seems as if the critique of innate ideas is intended to be a tacit argument on behalf of empiricism. So it certainly at least looks like Locke is doing something like this. First he's saying, hey, there's no knowledge that is inborn. We're not born knowing anything. And from there, it looks like it's supposed to follow that since we're not born knowing anything, all the knowledge that we have is acquired, and acquired by means of experience. That's at least what the structure of the argument looks like when we step back and look at Book 1 as a whole. But of course, there is a hole in the logic here. From the fact that knowledge is not innate, it does not follow that the sole source of knowledge could be the sole source of knowledge must be experience. This leaves out the possibility that some of our knowledge, if not all of our knowledge, may be known a priori. That is, not innate, but also not from experience. It ignores the possibility that our knowledge may be, for example, intuitive. And so indeed, one of the things that Descartes is going to say, because we're going to do Descartes after we do Locke, one of the things that Descartes is going to say is that some of our knowledge must be known a priori, that it's impossible that all of our knowledge should come from experience. And Descartes will have some very compelling arguments as to why that's the case. And so there is at least the appearance of a kind of a logical error here, to the extent to which it looks like Locke is trying to argue from there not being any innate ideas to the idea that all ideas come from experience. There seems to be a missing link there, explaining why we should rule out the possibility that some, if not, or some, most, or all of our knowledge is known a priori. So the question then becomes, well, why this sustained critique of the concept of innate ideas? And we get a clue, or actually we get more than a clue. We see another motivation for opposing innate ideas towards the end of Book 1 and end of Chapter 3. And in order to explain this, it'll require to talk a little bit about the context that Locke is working in. One of the most important ideas of what we'll call the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, so this is going to be the 17th and 18th centuries, one of the most important ideas, as we've already seen, I think as I've already mentioned, is the idea that the individual is an autonomous agent, that this idea of individual autonomy, or liberty, as we sometimes call it. This idea unpacks into a series of smaller ideas. When we speak about the Enlightenment idea of individual autonomy, what we really mean is the Enlightenment's belief that the individual is both free and capable in his actions and in his beliefs. That is, that we come to understand by our own efforts, and we decide how to act by our own will. The previous eras, right, the eras prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the Age of Reason, remember, were characterized by the idea of external authority. That the individual is ruled over by external forces, and this idea was pervasive in the sense that it was believed that the individual is ruled over in every sphere of his life by external forces, whether in politics, in religion, or in the realm of ideas. Right. Locke, I think, and it's it's more than a speculation. The things he says, I think, pretty clearly indicate this. Locke was in a sense offended by the notion that there are innate ideas. Indeed, he saw such a notion as an offense against the idea of individual autonomy, and specifically against the idea. It's an offense against the idea of intellectual autonomy. Remember, if an idea is innate, that means that it's inborn. And if it's inborn, what that means is that one can't help but hold it. Right? So if some idea is inborn, it means that you have that idea whether you like it or not. To say that an idea is innate is to say that no reasons are required to justify it. It's to say that it is beyond dispute, that it is simply a matter of necessity. Now, think about this. If you're a person who believes strongly in human intellectual autonomy, then the idea that there's a whole bunch of pieces of knowledge, that there's a whole stock of knowledge that is not the result of the individual's effort, but simply exists inborn, this speaks against the idea of intellectual autonomy. It speaks against the idea that we come to understand, that we come to know on our own engines, under our own lights. And the larger that stock of innate knowledge is, the less intellectual autonomy we would seem to have. Let me just point out a few of the passages where I think Locke expresses this idea. With respect to the idea that if knowledge is innate, then it's not the product of human activity, of the individual's effort. This is on page 116, paragraph 25. Locke says, "When men have found some general propositions that could not be doubted of as soon as understood, it was, I know, a short and easy way to conclude them innate. This being once received, it eased the lazy from the pains of search, and stopped the inquiry of the doubtful concerning all that was once styled innate." So Locke here is sort of saying that, look, to believe too strongly in innate ideas, to believe that they're innate ideas, is a force for laziness, for intellectual laziness, for lack of curiosity, for lack of inquisitiveness, for a refusal to question. Excuse me. On page 115, he says, "I hope it will not be thought arrogance to say that perhaps we should make greater progress in the discovery of rational and contemplative knowledge if we sought it in the fountain, in the consideration of things themselves, and made use rather of our own thoughts than other men's to find it. The floating of other men's opinions in our brains makes us not one jot the more knowing, though they happen to be true. Aristotle was certainly a knowing man, but nobody ever thought him so because he blindly embraced and confidently vented the opinions of another," unquote. So here again, Locke is disparaging the notion that there's anything that we know that isn't the result of our own effort. Indeed, he's disparaging the person who embraces knowledge that's not his own, that's not the result of his own endeavors. And so I think that entirely aside from the question of justifying empiricism, showing the truth of empiricism, the attack on innate ideas is as much about making a statement on behalf of human intellectual autonomy as it is about trying to prove the truth of empiricism. Indeed, I don't think that the attack on innate ideas by itself constitutes a sufficient proof on behalf of empiricism, because once again it leaves open the possibility that some, most, or all of our knowledge is neither innate nor empirical, but rather a priori or intuitive. Now, the main let's shift over to the actual details of Locke's critique of innatism, of innate ideas. Locke says that the primary argument on behalf of innate ideas, in other words, the primary argument being advanced by those who think that there is innate knowledge, the primary argument that they invoke is an argument from universality. The idea is that, well, there are some things that everyone believes. And if that's the case, if indeed there are things that everyone believes, that shows that those things must be inborn. And I guess the logic is supposed to be that if knowledge was the product of the individual's effort, one would expect a certain diversity within the context of knowledge. That is, if people came to every belief by their own lights, we would expect people to have different beliefs. Because there are some beliefs that seem to be widespread, that seem to be within the province of everyone, that would seem to suggest that some ideas, namely those, are in fact innate. They are inborn. Locke takes this to be the primary argument on behalf of innatism and spends the entirety of Book 1 criticizing this argument both in the context of speculative and practical knowledge. Locke has a general reply to this argument, to this position, although he offers a lot of sort of detailed arguments against individual innate ideas. His general reply to the concept of innate ideas and the argument I just articulated is that nothing is universally agreed to. So Locke, in a sense, denies the initial premise on which he claims the innateness theory is based. Right? People who support the notion of innate ideas say, well, there are some things that everybody agrees on, that everybody knows, and those things must be innate. Locke's answer is, actually, there's nothing that everybody agrees to. There's nothing that everybody knows. And that shows, in fact, that no knowledge is innate. Because, indeed, if there was innate knowledge, then everyone would know it. Right? If there were certain things that were inborn, then anyone human should know them. And because there's nothing that everyone human knows, Locke deduces that there is no knowledge that is innate. And Locke says this on page 39. Paragraph 4. He says, this argument of universal consent, which is made use of to prove innate principles, seems to me a demonstration that there are none such, because there are none to which all mankind give a universal assent. So Locke is going to reject the innateness theory by denying its initial foundational premise, by denying the idea that there's anything that everyone knows. And then he goes down. He goes to break down to run this argument in the area both of speculative knowledge and practical knowledge. With respect, and to give Locke credit, he does conduct the arguments in a way that gives his opponent his best possible case. In other words, the examples of innate, the examples of speculative knowledge, which Locke argues are not innate, are all the kinds of examples which, if they were innate, they would be the most likely candidates for innate knowledge, because they are by far the most universal. So take, for example, the basic principle of identity, that everything is identical with itself, that A equals A. Now, this certainly seems to be, if any principle of logic is universal, the principle of identity would seem to be one of them. Another one would be the principle of non-contradiction, which says that it cannot be the case that both P is true and not P is true. In both of these cases, we have speculative principles which, of course, enjoy widespread agreement. That is, an enormous number of people know these principles to be true. But the question is, does everyone know them to be true? And Locke says, well, certainly not. And we have to be just be prepared that Locke here is going to use some language that we don't use today. Locke says, with respect to basic mathematical and logical truths like the ones I've just given, Locke says, well, look, children and idiots don't know them. By idiots, he means mentally impaired people. And indeed, idiot was the scientific term at the time. And so I'm quoting him. Of course, this is today the word idiot is a word of derision. It's not a word. It's not a descriptive word of science. But when you read this, you have to realize, remember, this book is written in the 1600s. And in the 1600s, idiot was a technical term, was a scientific term for someone who is mentally deficient. So Locke wants to say, look, there's all sorts of people, whether we're talking about children or people who are mentally handicapped or retarded in some way, who don't have any, couldn't tell you the first thing about any of these logical and mathematical principles. But if this knowledge is allegedly inborn, is endemic to the human species, then indeed everyone should know them. And isn't it odd that there are some who don't? He says this on page 40. I won't read the quotations, but this is where he makes this argument, is on page 40. Now he does consider a possible response. Right? The defender of innateness might say, "Oh, no, that's not a good counterexample. What I meant to say was that the knowledge is innate in that it's inborn, but it's only, in a sense, accessible to people once they've come into the use of their reason." That is, that in a sense that the knowledge sort of sits latent until a person comes to be able to use their rational faculties, whereupon that knowledge becomes explicit. And obviously, in the case of a child, they haven't come to the use of reason yet, and so the knowledge hasn't yet become explicit. In the case of a so-called idiot, someone who's mentally impaired, they may never attain the use of their reason, and thus the knowledge may never become active. Locke does not think much of this reply. Locke says, look, if we know something as a result of reasoning, then that means it's not known innately. In other words, the only reason why a piece of knowledge might only come to be when one's reason is employed is because one proves it, right? What reason is an instrument of proof. Right? Our ability to reason is identical with our ability to prove things. And so Locke says, in a sense, that the reply contradicts itself. On the one hand, it says that a certain piece of knowledge is inborn. On the other hand, it says that piece of knowledge only comes to the fore when we're able to reason, which means that it comes to the fore when we are able to deduce it. And he says that this is just simply a convoluted, contradictory answer. And he talks about this on page 43. With respect to practical principles, the argument that there are either moral or other principles of action which are innate, Locke's basic argument here is this. He says there's far more universality, even though it's not truly universal. There's far more universality on basic logical principles like A equals A than there is on moral and other practical principles. That is, a lot more people agree that A equals A than agree on any particular moral or practical principle. Now, if it was not the case that if even the universality of logical truths was not sufficient to show innateness, then how could the far lesser unanimity that we have with respect to practical principles constitute a case for innateness? Right? There's even less agreement on practical principles than on speculative truths, and so practical principles provide an even worse basis from which to infer innateness. There's two places where he makes this argument. He makes it on page 64 from the first paragraph, quote, "If those speculative maxims, whereof we discoursed in the foregoing chapter, have not an actual universal assent from all mankind, as we there proved, it is much more visible concerning practical principles that they come short of a universal reception. And I think it will be hard to instance any moral rule which can pretend to so general and ready an assent as what is, or to be so manifest a truth as this, that it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, whereby it is evident that they are further removed from a title to being innate." Okay? So there he's just simply making the point that, look, if you couldn't make the case for innateness on the basis of mathematical knowledge and logical knowledge, which is widespread, though even they're not universal, certainly you're not going to make the case for innateness on the grounds of moral principles and other practical principles, which enjoy even less agreement, less universality than speculative ones. He also points out on page 72. Page 72, he points out the radically different values of peoples in different places and different times. He says on page 72, paragraph 9, "Robberies, murders, rapes are the sports of men set at liberty from punishment and censure. Have there not been whole nations, and those of the most civilized people, amongst whom the exposing their children and leaving them in the fields to perish by want or wild beasts has been the practice, as little condemned or scrupled as the begetting of them? Do they not still in some countries put them into the same graves with their mothers if they die in childbirth, or dispatch them if a pretended astrologer declares them to have unhappy stars?" And so what he wants to say is, look, here he's simply giving an illustration of just how radically different the mores and values are of peoples across the world and from one time to another, in order to show that there isn't anything like the kind of universality that one would need to suggest that such knowledge is innate. Now, one thing that Locke acknowledges and concedes, although it's not really a concession, I think it's entirely consistent with his stand against innate ideas, Locke does admit that there are certain innate practical mechanisms. In other words, I'll give you an example. That's the example that he gives. It would seem that every human organism is inclined to avoid pain and to pursue pleasure. That is, we instinctively, naturally pull away from things that hurt, and we instinctively and naturally reach out towards things that feel good. And we're, again, talking about instinctual reactions. This does not mean that a fully developed conscious person necessarily follows these inclinations, only that these inclinations are indeed innate. They are hardwired into every person. Locke acknowledges this on page 67. "Nature, I confess, has put into man a desire of happiness and an aversion to misery. These indeed are innate practical principles which do continue constantly to operate and influence all of our actions without ceasing. They may be observed in all persons in all ages, steady and universal." But notice, this is not an instance of innate knowledge. These are only innate tendencies. They are innate inclinations or dispositions. Locke is solely making an argument against the idea of there being innate knowledge, that there are substantive things that we know which do not come from our own investigations or our own reasoning, but which are simply inborn. And so Locke goes on to say, I do not deny that there are natural tendencies imprinted in the minds of men. Right? And so he acknowledges that there are things that are innate. He's not against innateness in general. What he's against is the concept of innate ideas. He's against the concept that there is knowledge that is innate. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Locke's speculations as to why people believe in innate ideas. Right, so given that Locke, apparently, so he thinks, has shown us that innate ideas, the very notion is bogus, why do so many people believe in them, and why do so many philosophers believe in them? And Locke offers both an innocent reason and a cynical reason. The innocent reason is that a number of things are taught early in childhood. That there are a number of fundamental things that we learn early on as children, as young children. And because we learned them when they were so young, we've forgotten the context of their acquisition. That is, there are ideas, there's knowledge that we have that we literally don't remember getting. That's how long we've had it. And because these ideas, because this knowledge reaches back as far as we can remember, it's easy to assume that they were innate, that they were there all along, that they were there from birth. In other words, because we can't remember acquiring this knowledge, it's easy for us then to conclude that it was never acquired, it was always there. And he says this on page 87. I won't read it all, but there's a page-length discussion of this, what I'm calling innocent reason for believing in innate ideas. There is also, however, a more cynical reason for believing in innate ideas, and this again taps into this more general point of contention that arises within the context of the age of reason and enlightenment. This cynical reason for believing in innate ideas goes right to the heart of Locke's case for and love for individual autonomy, especially intellectual autonomy. Think about it. Innate ideas, if there are any, are beyond dispute. That is, you can't argue about something that's inborn. Even if you prove it false, that does not stop the other person from holding it, right? If it is innate, if you are born thinking or believing P, then there's no way to dispute or refute or reject P. The concept, in short, provides cover for those who would seek to control others' beliefs and actions. Right? If I want to control what you think, one way is to tell you that is to convince you that what you think is imprinted on your brain from birth, that there's no other way that you could think. And I want you to think about how often supposedly innate characteristics have been invoked in order to keep people down or in order to keep people confined to certain roles. In other words, how often is it that person A has convinced person B that some characteristic, some idea was innate in order to prevent person B from stepping outside their prescribed role or to keep person B somehow otherwise under person A's control? Think about how common that is. I'll give you one very prominent example. Until quite recently, indeed until about the turn of the century, a little later than that in some places, women's allegedly innate emotionalism, so the argument was that women have an innate emotionalism that men don't have. This alleged innate emotionalism was used as an excuse, as a reason to deny women the right to vote, to deny them the political franchise, as well as to deny them political office. It was, in other words, it was asserted, well, women are so emotional by nature that they're unable to engage in sustained, clear thinking, and so we don't want them in any, they shouldn't be in any positions of authority or power. Right? Now, of course, this is totally bogus. Women are no less capable of these, have no more of a native or an innate block against performing these sorts of leadership functions as anybody else, as men are. And yet at the time, because men wanted to keep women disenfranchised and men wanted to keep women from holding political office, they in a sense invented something, and invented an obstacle, and by claiming it was innate, in a sense, made that obstacle unnegotiable, took it off the table. Locke talks about this on pages 116 to 117. Speaking of the idea of innate knowledge, quote, "It was of no small advantage to those who affected to be masters and teachers to make that the principle of principles, that principles must not be questioned. For having once established this tenet, that there are innate principles, it put their followers upon a necessity of receiving some doctrines as such. Nor is it a small power it gives to one man over another, to have the authority to be the dictator of principles and teacher of unquestionable truths, and to make a man swallow that for an innate principle which may serve to his purpose who teaches them. Whereas, had they examined the ways whereby men came to the knowledge of many universal truths, they would have found them to result in the minds of men from the being of things themselves when duly considered." So Locke sees the doctrine of innate ideas as an instrument of intellectual oppression. The notion of innate ideas allows tyrants cover for their tyranny. It gives an excuse for some people to hold other people back, for some people to constrain other people's thoughts and activities. And for this reason, more than any other, I think Locke is offended by the idea of innate knowledge. And so, aside from the purely academic and scholarly interest in providing an empiricist account of knowledge, in other words, sure, there's enormous academic and scholarly interest behind Locke's laying out a complete empiricist account of knowledge, but there is also a deeper, more sort of political purpose. For Locke, empiricism is in a way an articulation of human intellectual autonomy, because empiricism is at its heart the doctrine that knowledge is acquired by the individual in the individuals going out and engaging in the world. And that is a vision that affirms the intellectual autonomy of the individual in a way that is stronger than almost any other. And I think that the entire essay operates at both of these levels. On the one hand, it is a philosophical and even a scientific document. It is an attempt to offer, in a sense, the anatomy of give an account of the anatomy of human knowledge acquisition. But it also is a political text in that it purports to show the exercise of the individual's intellectual autonomy in all of its glory. And I think that Locke is who is intensely engaged in the liberation politics of his age. That is, in the argument, Locke was at the forefront, in the vanguard of those arguing for liberal democracy, as we will see towards the latter parts of the course. I think that Locke is as motivated here by those political notions of autonomy, by the political idea of autonomy, as he is by this more scientific academic interest in the origins of knowledge. Now, next time we're gonna go into the details. We're gonna examine more carefully Locke's account of how we acquire knowledge, and rather than things to think about in terms of sort of questions, I'm going to give you a bunch of key terms to pay attention to, because really what Locke's going to do now is sort of like I said, give an actual anatomy of human knowledge acquisition. And so I want you to pay attention to the details of that story, that picture. And here are some key terms to sort of notice and to see if you can define. The first is simple ideas, then complex ideas, ideas of sensation, ideas of reflection, primary qualities, and secondary qualities. So maybe jot these key terms down, and as you're reading the next parts of the Locke selections, I want you to see if you can identify these terms, define them, and explain in your own words how they fit into Locke's account of knowledge acquisition. So until next time, we'll see you later. Thank you.